Welcome to PD Connect, connecting the Parkinson's community with resources, information, and each other.
Today, we're excited to welcome John Alexander to the show. John is someone that I can honestly say that Tanya and I both admire for his dedication to the Parkinson's community and his optimistic approach to daily life with Parkinson's. Among other things, John is an ambassador for the Davis Phinney Foundation and a published author. John has a lot to offer in this interview, so we're going to break it up into 2 episodes. In the first episode, we'll chat about his book, The Journey Begins with 1,000 Miles. We'll cover the benefits he's experienced from cycling, and we'll talk about John's role as an ambassador for the Davis Phinney Foundation and all that entails. In the second episode, John will share more about his approach to living with Parkinson's and the acronym that he's created to describe that approach. He calls it Thriving. I think that's something we can all benefit from hearing. Let's kick things off with the first part of our interview. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you, Chad. Glad to be here.
John, people have described you as a natural connector. It's one of the things you talk about in your book, and that trait is important to a lot of what I think we're going to talk about on this episode, and it's an important part of who you are. Could you talk about what that means to you to be a connector?
Well, this is a term that actually came up all the way back when I was in college, and friends have commented on that and said it then and have said it since, that a natural trait that I seem to have is the interest and ability to try to bring people together, people that I find interesting, fascinating, have a particular skill that is something that others should know about, and I seem to find a way to introduce them to others who I think may have some similar interests. And I probably found that to be the case, throughout my working career as well. But it has truly come full circle since I've been involved with the Parkinson community. And with that, I mean that I've also had the ability to find information that was useful to myself or those close to me. And as I've found that information, particularly about Parkinson's, I've wanted to share that with other people who are trying to come to terms with, say, a recent diagnosis or where they're at in their Parkinson journey. And so by being a connector, I feel most fulfilled when I'm able to get people the information that they need that'll help them have a better quality of life.
That's really interesting, John. And one of the things I thought of as you were talking about that is that once Tanya reached a point where she was comfortable talking about having Parkinson's and was comfortable with me talking about it, one of the things I slowly started to do over time was that within 5 or 10 minutes of meeting someone, a stranger who I was becoming acquainted with, I would mention something about either Tanya having Parkinson's or usually go in a more roundabout way, talk about the fact that we do a lot of work with the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And my reason for doing that was, at first I just kind of did it without thinking about it. And then I started to realize that a surprisingly high percentage of the time, I made a connection in some way with that person, that it turns out that they had a family member who had it, or they had a friend who had Parkinson's, and there was something more they wanted to know, or they wanted to know about the work of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, or even, I'm doing I'm a runner and I've been looking for a cause to be associated with. And it's really interesting how that can just kind of happen, that when you're open about what's going on, and your connection to the Parkinson's community, how you can then from that develop an opportunity or create an opportunity to share information or make a connection. Do you typically let people know that you have Parkinson's or that you're involved in the Davis Phinney Foundation that we're going to talk about, or some other organization, fairly early on in getting to know them?
I think I do tend to do that. It's not uncommon for people, again, who are newly diagnosed to want to keep that to themselves. And there's a number of good reasons to do that. One, you're just getting used to the idea yourself. Or 2, depending on whom you have shared that with already. Have you shared it with your family? Have you shared it with your employer and such? Or 3, what level of indication might you display that would let people know that you possibly might have Parkinson's? But if I find that it's comfortable and it would be appropriate to mention, I've struck up conversations with people on a plane. And if that happens to be a day when my tremors are kicking up a little bit, I'll make a little joke out of it that, hey, sorry, I hope I'm not bothering you with my arm kind of moving here a little bit, but, I've got Parkinson's. And we'll proceed to share a couple things with them. If they want to hear more, that's fine. And if they don't, go away from it. But I've even found when you get into like fundraising, that's hard to do. Hard to come up to someone and ask them to donate to a cause. Except that people are more and more willing to do that. But what I found in one and really has been repeated case was when I asked someone to donate to a cause and told them it was related to Parkinson's. That person had a very strong connection to like a relative that had it and who meant a great deal to them. And that person, as you said, definitely wanted to have more information. And so I think you can become more comfortable in talking about it. And I think by being the one who introduces the topic, you have more control over how much you do reveal and what you share.
I'm going to ask Tanya about this, and I'm going to disclose to you and our listeners now, I actually don't know the answer to this question, but Tanya.
You're breaking the golden rule, Chad. Never ask a question you don't know the answer to.
That only applies as lawyers. That doesn't apply as podcasters. So I don't know if that applies in couples. Hopefully we won't need therapy after this question. So let me ask you, Tanya, once you got past that denial phase, did you find yourself revealing to more commonly to strangers or to, I'll describe it as people you're becoming acquainted with, that you have Parkinson's?
I still struggled with that, actually, up until about the past year, despite me going public, if you will, with my diagnosis. I just didn't feel like talking about it, quite honestly. So it was only within the past year that I meet people and then I'll bring it up. Oh, we're training for the marathon to raise money for the Michael J. Fox Foundation. I have Parkinson's disease, and kind of go from there.
Right. It's interesting that that's Tanya's response, considering that we're currently sitting on a podcast where we're publicizing to the entire world that she has Parkinson's, but on that one-on-one setting, it can be much more challenging to talk about it. And part of the reason I asked Tanya the question is I suspected I might get, compared to your answer, John, maybe a little different response. And to me, the important thing about that is that for each individual, they have to decide what their comfort level is in talking about having Parkinson's, when they're ready to talk about it, how they're ready to talk about it. And it could vary depending upon the setting and who you're talking to, right?
Yeah, that's very much true.
I think that's valuable for our listeners to hear that because, and the range of people who are listening to this, depending on where they are in their stage of their diagnosis and with the disease, I'm confident are varying levels of comfort amongst our listeners in terms of their willingness to talk about this. But when they reach a point where they're comfortable talking about it, I think it's great to hear from you, John, and from Tanya both, that there are some fantastic connections you can make. There is, and it can assist you in achieving fundraising goals or advocacy, raising awareness, or connecting a complete stranger to a resource or to information they desperately need, which we've experienced ourselves. Well, not to get too far off track, let me kind of bring us back. One of the ways that you've used your skill as a connector, as a natural connector, is as an ambassador for the Davis Phinney Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about your role as an ambassador? And for those listeners who don't know, what the objectives of the Davis Phinney Foundation are?
Certainly. The Davis Phinney Foundation was created by an individual of that name, by Davis Phinney. Davis Phinney was an Olympic cyclist. He won a bronze medal in the Olympics, and was one of the first Americans to win a stage of the Tour de France. He's actually, to this day, the winningest American cyclist of all time because he was a sprinter. He was the person that they put into position to make that last push to win the race. And so, as such, he would get the credit for the win, but they actually called him the cash register because he was so good at doing this one particular skill. He had a great cycling career. And as he was getting close to the end of that, he started to parlay that into some other opportunities and had signed up to become a television announcer for elite cycling. And around that time, he was about age 40 at that time, he began to develop some symptoms of Parkinson's, some tremor, some issues with speaking, etc. And that side railed the potential for having this career as a public commentator. So it took a little bit of time to get his head around that, because he had just come off of having to make the transition from being a performing athlete every day to going into something else. But he reached a point where he said, I'd like to do something with this to help the other people who have this condition. And while there are other groups, and it's obviously well documented, the Michael J. Fox Foundation does a tremendous job in research, and the close to what is about $800 million that they've raised to promote research and to promote all kinds of things to benefit the Parkinson community. What Davis set out to do was to simply help people with Parkinson's to, one, live well today, to do what they can proactively once they get a diagnosis, and as a result to have a better life and a much longer life with the condition. The one quote that I like to take from Michael J. Fox is that you don't die from Parkinson's, you die with it, which to me, when I found that early on, meant that, okay, this isn't like a diagnosis of an aggressive form of cancer where 6 months later you can expect to be getting your card punched. With Parkinson's, the average age for people who are diagnosed is around age 60, but in many cases, people have been diagnosed much younger, and it's becoming even more common for people to have what's called young onset Parkinson's, which is obviously what Tanya was diagnosed with. But even if it's if you're getting to your 50s or 60s, you still could live with that condition for 20, 30 years. Young onset, obviously, much more, and raising families, et cetera. So the Davis Phinney Foundation has truly grown, and some of the work that they do is to hold events called a Victory Summit. And that's a full-day event of information. They bring together medical professionals, some of the research doctors and clinicians, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, anyone who has an interest in the condition and can provide some light onto what can you do to help yourself and others. And they focus on a number of different areas. They focus on activity. They focus on exercise, for example, which is commonly stated now as important as your medication. That by exercising on a consistent basis in a variety of forms of exercise, you can actually cause some of the symptoms to be contained and actually quieted down almost as much as your medication can do. But they also talk about being informed, getting the accurate information that you need in order to deal with your condition. They talk about being prepared to go to your doctor's visits. So you're not just going and showing up and having the doctor look you over and say, okay, come back in 6 months and take these pills. You're part of the treatment process. You're part of analyzing what's taking place. You're part of deciding together with your medical team what you need to be doing in the next period of time. And as such, you have a much more productive visitations with your medical team. They talk about staying connected in terms of many people, or a number of people, might choose to completely bury their head in the sand, and they're embarrassed because they have Parkinson's or think they should be, which they don't. They don't want to go out with connect with other people, and really that's a very important thing to be doing in the form of support groups or in the form of doing some work for yourself in the Parkinson community that can make you feel better. There's really a whole list of things that they do. The ambassador group came about 4 years ago now, and what Davis Phinney Foundation did was to reach out to a number of individuals who had been active in some of their events and programs, and to have us be out in the community, sharing some of the information that Davis Phinney Foundation had accumulated, as well as sharing our own stories. So in my role as an ambassador for the Davis Phinney Foundation, I have spoken in front of Parkinson support groups. in a number of different areas. Certainly all the major towns, throughout Florida, but other areas as well, and even participated recently in a similar podcast on Radio Parkies, which is a program that's done globally. The whole idea of the ambassador is that we are out there to let people know that resources are available, that there is hope, that there are ways to get useful information, not just whatever is the hot topic of the week on the internet, but to get verified information that can improve their condition, and show them a way to live a solid life, to truly live well. So that's been extremely rewarding, in the work that I've done with them. And that ambassador program is about to double in size. We currently have about 15 ambassadors, and that's going to go up to almost 35 or 40 in this coming year.
That's fantastic. And are the ambassadors kind of spread all across the country?
Yeah, they are. They, with the initial group being about 10 individuals, they did their best to kind of position people, all across the country. But as an example, with the first group, we didn't have anyone in, say, Chicago or the Midwest almost at all. So this coming year, they'll be positioning someone in that area, because you can't be everywhere, but you can try to cover a good bit of ground.
John, you raised a great point about connecting with others who are experiencing the same condition. And I think that's particularly important for newly diagnosed. I was sitting here thinking, if I had to go back and change one thing, it would probably be, I would tell myself at the time I was diagnosed, this is all in hindsight, of course, find others who share this disease and connect with them, because connecting is just such a tremendous experience that makes you feel like you're not alone. So with that being said, for someone who is newly diagnosed that doesn't necessarily still want to come out and go public or go to an event, can they watch the Victory Summits online, or can they reach out to an ambassador via email?
Yes, they definitely can. The ambassadors are all listed on the Davis Phinney website, which is simply dpf.org, davisphinneyfoundation.org. And if you look for the ambassadors, our contact information is available to anyone who wants to find it, and then they can connect directly with us. And we're always glad to have a phone call, share information, respond to questions, etc. As far as an event like the Victory Summit, a little bit more about that event. They hold about 8 to 10 of those per year, and those again are spread throughout the country, and for that matter, a few international locations. And they change them every year, so that if you don't happen to find one that's going to be in your area anytime soon, you could look to the future and there might be one coming your way. But the last couple of events, they've actually made those a live webinar type of event. So a person anywhere with an internet connection could tune in and get the same type of great stories and recommendations and suggestions that a person who is attending those in person gets. And one of the things that's really special about their events is that they do not charge for a Victory Summit. It's offered at no charge. What they do is they suggest a kind of a pay it forward, where the people who have attended, they suggest that they make a donation to be able to pay for others to be able to come to that event at a later time.
That's outstanding. The resources available online these days are just vastly different from when I was initially diagnosed over a decade ago. So I'm really pleased to hear that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and I would also say, as far as attending a group, it's becoming easier, and through groups like the Davis Phinney Foundation or some very simple searches, you can find a Parkinson's support group in your area. Now, when you're at the point where you'd like to go to one, I would go to it, but go with an open mind. Often the major support groups tend to fit with, call it the more traditional Parkinson patients. By that I mean a higher age demographic, because some of the groups only meet, say, during the week on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, the average person who's still working would find it difficult to get to that. But the good news is that there are more and more support groups that are also beginning to focus on people with young onset Parkinson's. And those meetings often take place, say, in the evening. I know in the Orlando area, there's a young onset Parkinson group that meets, and they only meet like every other month, trying to make it so that they get a decent crowd each time. But they'll often have a presenter, but in addition to the presenter, it's the conversation amongst all the participants that's really, really impactful.
I agree.
Well, and Tanya actually attends the support group that you're talking about, and it is at a time that she's able to, and I'm able to watch our son, and it's after work, and it is much more convenient that way, particularly if you've got a household where you've got two parents who are working, or like you said, you're in the workforce. Going back to the Davis Phinney Foundation for a minute, for those who maybe want to Google it as opposed to going directly to the website, just so you know, it's spelled Davis, and then Phinney is Phinney. Phinney Foundation. And if you Google it, I just did it while I was sitting here, and there's some great videos that show up from Davis Phinney as well, and from the foundation, including one called Moments of Victory that I haven't seen yet, but looks like it'd be fantastic. So
that's a good one.
That's great information you provided, John. And I think it's really important that on our podcast, we highlight the different organizations, foundations that exist out there, and the areas that they specialize in, because as you pointed out, they don't all do the same thing. The Michael J. Fox Foundation historically is focused primarily on research. The Phinney Foundation has much more of a focus on living with the disease, and not just living, but thriving, notwithstanding having the disease. The thriving is a foreshadowing to something we're going to talk about in a little bit. Anyway.
Well, and some of the research that's being done, say, by the Davis Phinney Foundation, they're not taking on like the major projects and looking for like a new pill or something of that nature. What they're focused on is quality of life type projects. One of those, for example, was a project that started probably about 10 or 12 years ago, and that was focused on cycling and the benefits of cycling. And they funded some research that was being done by Dr. Jay Alberts at the Cleveland Clinic, and he had discovered that riding a bike at a consistent pace for a certain amount of time did tend to push back on your Parkinson's symptoms. So they're focused a little bit more on that type of research than some of the others we might see.
Right, which is a great segue, John, into your book called The Journey Begins with 1,000 Miles, and a central theme in your book is the benefits that you've experienced from cycling and the connections you've made through cycling. When did you first start cycling?
Let's see, it's probably about 2.
Okay. let's say when you
little bit fast forward.
Right.
Okay. No, but cycling was something that I enjoyed. I mean, literally, my first job was a paper route. The first thing I ever saved up for was my newspaper baskets for my bike, for like my Huffy bicycle. And, very proud to have earned that money so I could, make more money in my newspaper route. Got a bike when I was in college and rode that all over the place. I've told people about riding the trails at school and the fact that the path was only like 4 inches wide. They go, no, you must mean 4 feet. I go, no, 4 inches, because that's how college students lay things out. You decide where you want to go. You just keep going over it, and then all of a sudden you've got a path. And all you needed for a bike was just the width of the tire. But bike riding was something that was always kind of fun. And after I was diagnosed, I went for a little bit of time and it didn't really do much of anything. And I was 57 years old when I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. So, didn't quite fall into the young onset category, which is considered like 50 or earlier, though I still like to think that this was early for me. And I thought I hadn't been exercising a lot anyway, and I probably should get out and do some more. So I took my bike out. I had a good bike that I'd come across, which was called a hybrid. It's more of a comfort type bike rather than like a road racing type bike and that sort of thing. And began riding. And one of the first things I did was crash. Now that's not really a positive direction for getting going with an activity, but I would call it operator error. I was going too fast for a little turn. There was a small bridge going across a creek, and I just didn't make the turn as effectively as I should, and I ran into the side support bars. I didn't completely fall over. I was able to stay vertical, but some things that were in my bike basket fell out and went into the bottom of the creek. And at that point, I said, I probably should learn how to do this better. Like riding a bike, you just always remember it. But you can always improve your skills at any point in life. And so I took advantage of a program that was fairly new to the area called Cycling Savvy in the Orlando area. And it's now a national program. But what that program did was gave me the skills and confidence to ride whenever and wherever I wanted to go. And out of that came, again, another sense of community with the other individuals that I was riding with. Now, these weren't necessarily individuals with Parkinson's, but my symptoms were fairly well controlled at the time. And so I was able to just go have fun with a bunch of people doing something I loved and enjoyed. Often would finish a ride in the evening with ice cream with this new group of friends. I was still traveling for work, and when I would go to a town, if I had any extra time, I would rent a bike and ride that bike around the area that I was at, which was a lot of fun because I found that I could discover places that I hadn't thought of or seen before. For example, in San Antonio, Texas, everybody thinks of the Alamo. Yeah, I rode my bike to the Alamo, but I also rode my bike a few blocks away to this beautiful set of Victorian houses that was developed years ago. So it became something that was just a lot of fun. And it also became my way of getting more consistent exercise and doing something that in the long run was good for me in terms of my Parkinson's disease.
In your book, you share some pretty interesting and somewhat entertaining stories about different rides that you've taken or different places you've ridden your bike. One of which that stood out to us was you've ridden your bike in Columbus Circle in New York City, which is, correct, for those who haven't experienced Columbus Circle, has to be one of the busiest places on the entire planet in terms of automobile traffic, foot traffic, and horse-drawn carriage traffic, and apparently also cycling. Normally in pedicabs, as Tanya and I have experienced, which was a harrowing experience, by the way. So what in the world led you to decide to ride your bike through Columbus Circle?
Well, what I wanted to do, my goal, it's good to have a goal. My goal was to go to Central Park and to ride my bike in Central Park. And I knew enough about that to know that, once I was in Central Park, everything was fairly well contained. There were horse-drawn carriages, as you mentioned, but I did a little bit of research at the hotel, and I found a place where I could rent a bike, but that was on one of the main streets that was a bit south, I think southwest of Central Park. Little did I know that if I researched a bit further, I would have found that they actually rent bikes physically in Central Park. So I did have to get from, I think it was 57th Street or something. I did have to get from there up to Central Park. And that took me directly through Columbus Circle, which is a huge roundabout with, I think, about 6, 7, 8 lanes. And once you get into that, it's kind of like a vortex. You're just captured, and you just make your way around. But what I'd learned from the class was the way to literally drive my bike so that I was somewhat going with the flow, but going with the flow with a controlled aspect so that I was comfortable that I wouldn't cause any harm to myself or anybody else.
Well, I was sitting here just laughing. I almost have tears in my eyes because I had the same reaction when I read your book. I thought, is he crazy? Columbus Circle? Because Chad and I had a biking experience, but we were not in control of the bike. We took a pedicab, and I thought we were going to die.
Riding a pedicab in New York particularly during rush hour it can be a harrowing experience. It's a lot like riding a cab, except you don't have steel around you to give you a certain level of comfort. It's just you in the open air and a cyclist.
And that's right. And I'm not so sure that our cyclists have taken the cycling savvy course.
Probably not. They take the kamikaze course, I think.
Exactly. So kudos to you for navigating that difficult situation.
That was a lot of fun. But many of the rides that I began doing, were certainly much more controlled. While I did a number of rides that were on roads, those were still often with groups, or they might be like a fundraising kind of an event. I've done some rides to raise funds for the Ronald McDonald House or for diabetes, that kind of thing. And those are events that have monitors in busy areas. They have police to direct traffic, et cetera. But what I'll find myself doing just as much is to just ride the trails. We're fortunate in our area to have a number of accessible trails, and you can go out for a 5-mile, 10, 15, 30-mile ride if you want, and not have to interact with vehicles at all other than at crossings and stop signs. But all of those together made me a much more comfortable and competent cyclist.
John, as I understand it, you've reached a rather significant milestone in terms of thousands of miles ridden. What is for as long as you've been tracking it, which obviously doesn't date back to when you were 2 years old, how many miles have you ridden at this point?
It's probably about 4,500 miles or so.
Okay.
And so that initial 1,000 that I described really came about as once I did start to actively ride. It started literally from the day that I took that class, which was I think it was November of 2010. I just, kept a log. There's a lot of different ways and tools you can use to do this, but every time I went for a ride, I noted the number of miles and added it to an increasing total. And I never had any kind of thought or initial aspiration for doing something that lofty, but by just getting involved in a few group rides and doing some on my own, all of a sudden I was at 200 miles. And then I heard about an event that I decided to take part in. It was a ride in South Dakota called Ride with Larry. And this is particularly interesting from a number of directions. Ride with Larry was created by a gentleman named Larry Smith, who at the time had been diagnosed for over 22 years. He had been a captain of police in Connecticut, and when he was diagnosed, he was a very responsible person. So he said, I know I can't do this particular job anymore at the level I need to. So he and his wife decided to move to an area where she could get a teaching position at a college and get on a tenure track. And then he retired from police work, but he kept up some of the hobbies he had done, which was one of those included baking bread. And he was actually named in 2003 by Oprah as the best bread in America, wow, which I can attest to because I've had the bread. So here it was all of a sudden in 2010 where he decided he told his wife he wanted to do something really big before it's too late. And the usual thing for cyclists is to ride across America. And obviously that's a huge adventure for just about anybody. His wife said, well, Larry, that's a great idea, but let's throttle that back a little bit. And so what they chose to do was to ride across their state at the time of South Dakota, which north to south is 300 miles. And they set up a team complete with an RV, which would be really their mobile kitchen and a support for them. And with a small group of people initially, about 10 people, they began their rides, and they broke it up into about 5 days. And at the end of each day, they would meet with a Parkinson community in the town that they'd ended up in and share their story, what they were doing, how they'd learned about the benefits of exercise, and just beginning to share some of the message that would help other people with Parkinson's. His niece and her husband were actually documentary filmmakers, and they decided to tell his story or capture his story in film. And they put out a kind of a trailer, which was included Larry asking people to come up to South Dakota and join him for this adventure. And I knew that was just completely speaking to me. Now here, just a few months before, I hadn't ridden on a road at all. And I hadn't ridden that many miles, even since. But once I decided to go, and I invited my son to come join me, to fly in from Los Angeles, which was interesting. I called him up and I said, Brian, would you like to go to South Dakota and ride bikes with Dad? And he goes, sure. I called him back 10 minutes later, do you even own a bike? He said, no. So
that was going to be my question. Was your son a cyclist at the time that you made this request of him?
No, he wasn't. And so we got him hooked up with a bike, and he began doing training, and he was phenomenal. He did a great job, and mainly as one of many of what I call my guardian angels, who kept an eye out for me and kept me safe during the ride. But fast forwarding, so we went up for simply the last day of the event, which is a 65-mile bike ride, and it was amazing to see Larry's spirit and tenacity, to meet other people and hear all kinds of other stories of what people were doing. I met one gentleman who was 93 years old who was doing this ride. So it was just a tremendous amount of camaraderie and lessons that were learned from that ride. But the film did end up getting made, and I felt good about the fact I stayed very connected with the film crew. And I began writing letters to let people know about this fabulous film. And so I like to think that I was instrumental in helping it to get into the Orlando Film Festival, the Tampa Film Festival, and even the Cleveland Film Festival. But every one of the 10 or 12 film festivals that I was in, both domestically and internationally, it won the most inspirational film. And I was really excited to see recently that there's a Parkinson group called Parkinson Life in Europe, and they published a list of must-see films about Parkinson's, and Ride with Larry is one of those films. And it's available on Amazon. People can rent it. They can buy it. Not only is it inspirational from the fact that this gentleman, he's had this disease, he's had it for a long time, and he goes out and he accomplishes this athletic feat, but it's a true love story between Larry and his wife Betty, who is his main caregiver. So it's really has always been special that I was part of that. In fact, I have a poster on my wall in my office, about that event, and I'll always be focused on that as being an important contribution to my involvement with cycling and Parkinson's. Anyway, by the time I'd done the ride with them, I had ridden 500 miles. So I decided to keep going, and had a couple of friends who said, we'll help you get there. By that, they were involved in other group rides, and we fit in a few of those. And 1 year from the date that I took my Cycling Savvy class, it happened to be at about the time of the year we are now, there happened to be a ride that was on Veterans Day. And so one of the friends who I was going to ride with had another buddy come along, and that gentleman had been a Marine, so he's wearing a Semper Fi jersey on the day that we decided to cap off my achieving a goal of riding 1,000 miles in 1 year. And it was really meaningful to do that. But what it meant for me, or how I use that in the book, is the journey begins with 1,000 miles, was here I had been told about a year and a half before, that I had what is considered by many to be a progressive, degenerative, neurological disease for which there is no cure. And I was able to do something that, tested my mettle a little bit, but it was enriching, and it made me feel better, and I felt more in control of my life. And I think other people have gotten a good message from it as well. So it was very important to do. And I continued for the next several years of hitting that 1,000-mile mark. And then I ran into some moments where I couldn't do it quite as much. I was having some issues with a shoulder, which needed to be replaced. And that was due to arthritis and bone spurs and stuff. So some of my activity started to shift a little bit. But I think when times sometimes get tough with Parkinson's, I look back and I say, I did that at that time, and I can still do that to the extent that I feel capable of and have the desire to do. So the subtitle of the book is you mentioned the word thriving, but I say thriving with Parkinson's disease through hope, inspiration, and perseverance. The reason I say with instead of in spite of Parkinson's disease is because I've actually found that even though it wasn't a choice, but by going down this path of living with Parkinson's, I've met so many phenomenal people that have enriched my life and made me not only be able to cope, but to go to a new level as a person, and as someone that can help others as well, by the fact that I came down with something that I certainly didn't expect to do, but I'm trying my best to make the most of.
John, what you just talked about resonates so much with us because, having talked with Tanya on several occasions, that her experience is similar to yours in terms of being diagnosed with Parkinson's and living and thriving with Parkinson's disease, as you describe it, has led her to do so many things she wouldn't have otherwise done and to make connections she wouldn't have otherwise made. And it's something she's talked about on the podcast. It's something she's spoken about publicly. But in that way, your journeys are very similar. But for her, rather than cycling, it's been running and returning to something that she loved to do pre-Parkinson's and taking it to a completely different level by running the New York City Marathon, which is, she had never run a marathon before. And she dragged me along as well. And I mean, Tanya, you want to talk about how that's kind of similar to what John's talking about, right? Well, and actually, let me ask you this, John. I think this is clear from what you said a moment ago, but just to make it clear, would you have ridden 1,000 miles and achieved this incredible accomplishment if you had not been diagnosed with Parkinson's? Would you have ever gone down that road?
No, I don't think in a million years I would have done that, because it just didn't see a need or a purpose to do it. But here I found something that I'd seen the evidence and proof that by having an activity that I enjoyed and put some effort into, that my life would be and then truly was better as a result of committing to cycling, as Tanya's committed to running, and many people are doing that. But there's more and more types of activities that are becoming available to people with Parkinson's, and actually adapted specifically so that they work well to maximize the positive outcome of helping a person to have more mobility, to improve their strength and their balance so that they don't fall and have an issue with that. And as you meet more and more people, you realize that you can do much more than you ever considered possible. And yet at the same time, and I think we've all talked about this too, you have to choose to do what works best for you. We know some folks who have done some remarkable athletic things, but that's not for everybody. Some people simply won't be able to do that, maybe even because of situations that are not even anything to do with their Parkinson's disease. I tried one activity that's become real popular, which was boxing. And I went to the gym and learned about the boxing. I loved it. I loved the idea of throwing the punches and moving and all of that. But the instructor at one point said, well, let's do jumping jacks. It's like, yeah, well, that's cool. I did jumping jacks last time when I was 15 years old. And I discovered quickly that I did not have any business doing jumping jacks. And the reason is that non-Parkinson related issues, that I have some degenerative discs in my back, which are due to arthritis and probably heredity. And by doing the jumping jacks, I actually aggravated those. And that sidelined me even from cycling for several months. So you've got to pick and choose the things that are best for you. Going back to that, however, there's a program called Rock Steady Boxing that I've spoken with many of their coaches from around the country and told them my story of not being able to continue with boxing. And they said, if you'd been in my class, I would have asked you questions beforehand so you would not have been put in that position. And you probably would be doing this on a regular basis. So it's good to know that things are being done that will not only give us opportunities to get out and move and become stronger, but also protect us as well.
Absolutely. And the Rocksteady boxing program has become wildly popular in the last few years. And I think we've talked about it on the podcast before. And at some point, we'll probably have somebody on to talk about that program, because boxing is one of the things that Tanya does that she's experienced tremendous benefits from. She doesn't do it through Rocksteady. She's got a trainer she works with who yesterday had her planking when she came home. She comes home and goes through like what the workout is that they did boxing. And I'm just looking at her going, I do not envy you that you just did that. But John, I think this is a good stopping point for us, since we're going to break this up into 2 episodes, because there is so much to talk about. And you've shared some tremendous resources with our listeners during this episode. And what we want to do on the next episode is talk about an acronym that you developed. We've talked about this word thriving. And from that, you've developed an acronym that I think would be very beneficial for our listeners to hear, ties into some of what we talked about on this episode, and maybe some topics that we can go into a little bit more on the next episode. Also on the next episode, we can talk a little bit more about your personal journey with Parkinson's in terms of diagnosis, treatment, symptoms, that sort of thing, just so our listeners better understand where you're coming from, because each person's path is different. But until we kick off that next episode, I want to thank you for joining us today. And thanks everyone for listening in, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks, John.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in for this episode of PD Connect. Please help us connect with the Parkinson's community by spreading the word about this podcast. You can find us online at pdconnect.org and on Facebook at PD Connect Podcast. You can also follow us on Twitter at PD_Connect. Again, that's PD_Connect. Until next time, this is Chad and Tanya signing off.